I was very much sort of influenced by what would be the word? Sort of, let's say, alternate historiographies. Interests. I was much more interested in coming at this through fragments and through essentially trying to
Yeah.
avoid these very clear linear narratives and instead sort of looking at how these things branch off and how these
Yeah.
various scenes will flourish in one place and then in another and so on. And that's been really useful. That's been really helpful. And one of my I guess one of my sort of outreach pieces that I've written recently, which I wrote for this magazine called Resident Advisor, which is sort of it's like a big industry magazine for electronic music online. I wrote this long piece about a year ago called "An Alternate History to of Sexuality in Electronic Dance Music," and it was specifically doing some of this, some of this work, and it gave precisely a very quick potted history of sort of the
Right.
accepted or the conventional narrative of dance music with
Right.
an eye towards queer cultures, but then it spent another half of it just sort of doing very nonlinear kind of topographical sort of like little small descriptions of things that have happened, like for example the lesbian involvement in the techno scene in the Paris scene in the last few years, which has been this really interesting
Right.
case, or interviews with an artist from South Africa who talks about the Kwaito scene and the dance music scene in South Africa and sexuality and race. Like I did these sort of more sort of fragmentary bits as well,
Right.
and it seemed to have worked really well. I actually got a really good response.
Yeah. That's really great, and especially if it's a kind of industry publication,
Yeah.
and you're writing the kinds of histories that people are responding to. That sounds really phenomenal. And, I was thinking, like, as you were talking about approaching history from this kind of fragmentary place, that was something that was really important to me, kind of in my projects too,
Yeah.
and that, and and this where no or very few history. That's actually really important to leave history undone in a sense. I think
Okay.
that allows for other people to come in and play instead of instead of cementing a kind of narrative, but like intimating, connections or affinities or,
Yeah.
ways of kind of thinking through, like methodologies for moving through content, I think
Right.
is so much more valuable than it is to, I mean, like I do want to see someone write, a history of gay and lesbian leather communities.
Yeah.
Like I think that would be a really fascinating book. That's just not me.
Right.
And I
It's not your
actually think
project.
that
Yeah.
and I just think that I think politically it's more useful to have a history that is generative, rather than one which one has to be deferential towards, right? Like, I mean, I think
That's
like I
huge,
think about certain history, and I'm sure this is true for you too in your work, but I think, there are certain, like you can't submit like any work on like queer or gay culture in New York without referencing like George Chauncey's book. And
Right.
I think that there's a kind of, as
Yeah.
great a piece of scholarship as that may be, like there's a kind of tyranny to that narrative where
Yeah.
like that becomes the thing that like
Right.
has to be
It eclipses all other
used
narratives. Yeah.
right. That kind of helps determine like where do you fit in that. And if you don't reference it, you must be ignorant or totally unaware.
Right.
And so this kind of idea of fragmentary scholarship or fragmentary approach is actually really interesting to me as a way of kind of, it's interesting that you mentioned that, partially because for me it's a way to kind of do work otherwise,
Right.
in a historical situation,
Right. Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
anyway,
No, I definitely
sorry.
see you. Yeah, I mean, actually, some of the responses that I got, like when I wrote this piece for Resident Advisor, they have a very sort of active commentator community. Let's say, like there's a lot of people who will jump on
Sure.
and make comments, and a lot of there were some comments that were just sort of for or against, positive or negative, but there were a lot of people who actually jumped in and said, this is really interesting, but you forgot about this one scene that I was part of, or you didn't
Right, that's
like.
right.
So, and what was nice was that people actually jumped in and provided that. So, like in the comment
Right.
threads, the comments
Right.
thread, there were a lot of like little short couple paragraphs, sort of historical fragments being also contributed by readers of
Yeah.
scenes that I wasn't part of or wasn't aware of, or like little details. little corners that for them were, of course, central. I think that was really interesting as well
Right.
for having a,
And that's it. It's like it becomes a generative model.
Mhm.
It becomes a model for generating, for lack of, in like tech wonker, this kind of neoliberalist speak for like user engagement. I mean, it
Right,
becomes a way
right.
of creating more historians where they're, or at least empowering more voices to be historians of their own moment,
Yeah.
way that like, that may not have otherwise happened. It sounds like that's a really beautiful thing with what you
Right.
posted on Resident Advisor. It sounds like that really happened.
Yeah, well, and I think it seems like where both of us meet, so to speak, methodologically or disciplinarily,
Yeah.
even though we're coming, one from history
From
and one
different
from
places,
anthropology,
yeah.
is very much in this space of like oral histories,
Mhm.
or at least the space of history that's in the process of being written in many ways,
Yes.
and
Yes.
what do you do when you have multiple voices that may
Yeah.
contradict each other, but all have a very solid claim to to writing, to historiography itself, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I often, and maybe this is like dovetailing away from like a more academic discussion, but I'm often very cynical of people who are assured in a way.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
I
I
like,
very much agree. Yeah.
and so part of that methodology for me is admitting what I think is not a very popular thing to admit, which is like, I at the end of the day, this history cannot be written in the ways that we
Right.
assume it can be written, and at the end of the day, like we cannot be completists about this, and
Right.
that fantasy of being a completist is actually detrimental to like to bringing forth other people or calling forth other voices that are not our own.
Yeah.
And I think like ultimately, like, I'm excited about my work, but I'm also really excited about the work of other people. Like,
Yeah.
truly,
Yeah.
not like fake academic excited. Like, oh, I'm excited that more
Right.
people are working on me. But seriously, I have some issues
Yeah.
with like other people working on the same. I am truly, literally elated when like more people
Are working
uh,
on intersecting
are working
topics.
on it.
Yeah.
And I think like that's our task. I
Yeah.
think especially you and I, as kind of looking at kind of movements that either are not taken seriously, moments,
Yeah.
movements, kind of places that are not taken or intimacies that are
Yeah.
not taken as
Definitely. Yeah.
seriously, and kind of just continuing to make room for not us, and that is what in that equation too.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
and that's a
Yeah.
great attitude to have, and I definitely follow you, or like definitely am
Yeah.
there with you, so to speak, in being wary of what would be the word, like wary of overly finished or certain
Yeah.
narratives, claims, whatever it is,
Yeah.
explanations. And one thing that I was really one thing that sort of completely transformed the way that I did work and like I
Uh-huh.
wrote and did theory and so on was sometime during my PhD years. I encountered that one chapter from Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's touching feeling on
Feeling.
paranoid reading and
Yeah.
and reparative reading,
Yeah.
and that for me
Yeah.
really precisely that sort of confirmed a lot of my own sort of
Yeah.
instincts or intuitions or whatever, that I was
Yeah.
these sorts of all-encompassing theories or narratives that explain everything cleanly always smack to me of erasures of various sorts. And
Yeah.
I can see why they're useful in certain ways, and why they
Sure.
kind of need to be
Sure.
around to a certain degree.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
but one of the things that was really transformative about that piece for me was making the argument that it's also really generative and really really useful and actually important to also
Yeah.
have approaches that actually that embrace the contradictions or the ambiguities, or that accept that there will
Yes.
be no such thing as a perfect explanation for this or
Yeah.
a complete
Sure.
a complete story.